I want to begin today's lesson by turning to Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22. It says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It's a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid.' And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water, and he came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" You know, when I was growing up, every time I heard this lesson preached, it was always preached in one specific way. It was about how Peter begins to sink because of his lack of faith. Now, clearly, you can create a lesson or a sermon around that concept. But I think there is a much, much bigger picture to this particular story. Have you ever thought about this fact? That the boat was full of disciples. It was full of disciples who were totally comfortable just sitting right where they were, because they all stayed in the boat. Peter was the only one who sank because he decided to get out of the boat and walk on the water towards Christ. I think there is a very important question to ask. Why exactly did Peter get out of the boat in this situation? Was Peter scared? I think we all know the answer is yes. So what caused him to get out? Well, I kind of think that Peter's fear of disappointing Jesus was greater than his fear of the wind, the storm, and the sea. Yes, I know he sank because of his lack of faith, but I think we could easily argue that his faith was greater than all the other disciples that just remained seated in the boat. You know, we're living in a really interesting time with social media and all the things around us. And it kind of feels like a lot of parents want their children to be stars, that every parent believes a child is special. You know, I had a high school teacher who hated this concept, and he would always say, "Never forget, you are special, just like everyone else." Parents today seem to want their children to be professional athletes, star musicians, YouTubers, or whatever. And this desire for parents to have their children be perfect little beings is a problem. First of all, I really believe parents partially do this to deal with their own deficiencies. They use their child as an attempt to get it right and get all the things right that they got wrong. They didn't become the athlete. They didn't become the actress or the valedictorian, so what they do is they try to live that through their children. Maybe they weren't popular in school, but they go to every measure to make sure their child is. And I wonder how many people are actually having their own issues run the way that they parent. Are you familiar with the concept of helicopter and lawnmower parents? Helicopter parents is a new term that's come up in recent years, and a helicopter parent is called that because they constantly hover over their child like a helicopter. Lawnmower parents simply mow down every single obstacle that is in their child's way. You know, in my previous lesson, How Did We Get Here?, I outlined some of the things that our country is currently facing. And I honestly think that this is one of the major issues. Parents seemingly doing everything they can to keep their child from experiencing failure. And I think this sets up children to not know how to deal with obstacles and problems in their lives. There are so many helicopter and lawnmower parents out there that go to great lengths to shield their child from things like disappointment, to shield them from challenges, to shield them from opportunities that ultimately help them grow. And by not allowing a child to fail or experiencing disappointment, it's quite ironic because what it's doing is it's rendering these children helpless, which is the very thing that their parents are trying to protect them against. An author named Jessica Leahy wrote a book called The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so their children can succeed. And in that book, she said, quote, "Today's overprotective, failure-avoidant parenting style has undermined the competence, independence, and academic potential of an entire generation," end quote. In an article written a few years ago entitled "How to Survive the College Admissions Madness," one freshman at DePaul University said, "Throughout my years of schooling, there was one goal in life: college. I was conditioned to fear failure, as it might keep me from going to my dream school. Every slip up, every missed homework assignment, every absent kept me one step further from my goal. In other words, I could never make a mistake." Making a mistake for this kid at DePaul was literally the worst thing that could happen to him. This environment is created when parents step in and insert themselves into their child's life in places where it is best for the child to figure it out for themselves. Too many parents yell instructions from the sideline at sporting events. Too many parents help too much with homework or even do it for them. Too many parents question their teachers about their kids' grades, or they interfere with their parents' friendships. These things don't help children. At best, it just shows them that their parents are overbearing and difficult, and it causes them to be embarrassed of you. But at worst, you're actually teaching your child that they are totally incapable and totally incompetent to handle their own lives. You know, we mentioned helicopter parenting a minute ago. Helicopter parenting removes children's decision-making powers. It removes their ability to rebound and to persevere and learn resilience. They don't know how to be disappointed. They don't know how to handle errors. You know, most therapists will tell you that resilience is an absolutely necessary component for success in life. Yet many of today's parenting styles just simply don't allow for resilience to even be built. This is why we have this scenario right now where college students are seeking out counseling at an unprecedented number for depression and anxiety. And what is scary is when they come to counseling, most of these issues would be things that many people would consider quite minimal. You know, I know this can be controversial, but I heard the phrase election anxiety after 2016, where young people were going to therapy literally because they were having problems dealing with an election. This isn't about politics. I could care less what your political affiliation is. But if you are experiencing severe anxiety and depression over an election that keeps you from living your daily life, I don't think it's unfair to say you might have problems with resiliency, that you might have problems figuring out how to deal with things that don't go your way. That is why college students are going to counseling for failing a test, for dealing with a breakup, or having their parents interfere to talk to their professors because they have a bad grade. That clearly shows a lack of coping skills, a lack of being able to deal with failure. And I think the reason for that is very simple, because they were never allowed to experience it in the first place. You know, I am a huge Michael Jordan fan. I am at the age where my entire life I grew up watching him play basketball. And in his public speaking engagements, he has preached the importance of failure. Michael Jordan once said, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take a game-winning shot and missed. I have failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." Let me ask you a question. What is it that motivates your child? We can be motivated by money, by love, by patriotism, by duty, by pride. But statistics will actually show you that the vast majority of people are most primarily motivated by fear. That's the reason I started with the story of Peter. His fear of disappointing Jesus, you see, I believe, was greater than his fear of the storm and the water. President FDR said in his inaugural address that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, if fear is the only thing we have to fear, then how do we overcome it? Well, I think we have to realize, like Peter, that we are going to sink every now and then. There are a lot of positive things about failure, and that's what I want to talk to you today about. First of all, failure actually means that you are trying. Teddy Roosevelt once said that the only man who never makes a mistake is the man who never does anything. In Proverbs 24:16, it says, "For the righteous falls 7 times and rises again, but the wicked stumble in times of calamity." Failing and getting up for failure is literally a biblical principle. I think about all of the people that we admire throughout history who have failed miserably in their lives. Lucille Ball was dismissed from drama school because they told her that she was too quiet and too shy. Clint Eastwood was told by Universal Pictures that he had a chip in his tooth, his Adam's apple stuck out way too far, and he talked too slow to be a movie star. Albert Einstein failed his first college entrance exam. Henry Ford forgot to put reverse in the first car that he manufactured. In 1957, he bragged about making the car of the decade, and it had doors that wouldn't close, a hood that wouldn't open, paint that peeled off, and a horn that stuck. Think about Napoleon. He finished 42nd in his military class. Charles Schulz, the cartoonist of Peanuts, was told by his high school yearbook staff that his cartoons were not acceptable. Dr. Seuss's first book was rejected by 27 publishing companies. Walt Disney was fired from a newspaper because they told him he didn't have any good ideas. The Beatles were passed over by Decca Records. Beethoven was told by his music teacher that he was hopeless as a composer. Van Gogh never sold a painting in his lifetime. Babe Ruth, who is still to this day often considered the greatest baseball player to ever live, struck out 1,316 times. That's almost twice as many times as he hit a home run. Thomas Edison attempted to make the light bulb 1,800 times and failed. And I love what he said when asked about it taking him so many times. He said, "I now know 1,800 ways that a light bulb will not work." Abraham Lincoln lost 7 state and national elections before being elected president of the United States. And as we mentioned at the top of our lesson, Peter failed on numerous occasions. My word, he rebuked the Lord. He placed Moses and Elijah on the same level as Jesus in the Transfiguration. He used violence when Jesus was arrested. He denied Jesus 3 times in his hour of need. He stuck his foot in his mouth over and over again. All of that before becoming a great soul winner for the kingdom. These people took great risks, and they understood what it took to confront and defeat failure. So number 1 simply means if we are failing, we are trying. Number two is failure teaches us to see the whole picture. I really believe this, but life is all about perspective. Your perspective determines how you perceive what happens to you and what happens in the world around you. It will determine how you react. I'm not a big fan of art, but a few years ago, we went to the Parthenon in Nashville, which is where I'm from, in Nashville. And in Nashville, they have an art museum inside of the Parthenon. And there's a beautiful painting in there of a ship at sea in kind of a difficult storm. And I don't know why, but for some reason that painting always was something that I loved to go look at when we'd visit the Parthenon. So we would go whenever we had families or friends from out of town. That was always something they wanted to go see, and I would mosey over to see the painting. And as I walked over to the painting one time, I got really close to it. And as I got really close to it, I could see brushstrokes. I could see globs of paint. I could see things really that were kind of ugly imperfections in it. But when I stepped back away from it, all of those imperfections kind of molded into this beautiful work of art. I think we need to remember that sometimes, that our life is in the hands of a master artist, and that it's where we stand when we look at the picture that makes all of the difference. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." If he is the master artist who is in control of our lives, then we need to understand that maybe those failures are part of the entire picture. And it isn't the small failure that matters, but it's the entire picture as a whole. Number three is failure reminds us of our faulty definition of success. You know, we live in a world, and we all know this, where success is about how much money you make, how good you look, how big your house is, how nice your car is, how famous you are, how many likes you get on YouTube or Facebook. But it's not the biblical definition of success at all. Mark chapter 8 and verse 36 tells us that. "For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?" There's only one thing important for the Christian, and that is that we make sure that we are living in a way that God wants us to live. Number four is failure makes you tough. And I think this is important today. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, it says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Failure teaches us we need to rely upon God. And at times, being weak means we need to rely on others. That is not bad. Mark 14:31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" You know, as we talked about that story of Peter on the top of the lesson, Peter got out of the boat. He walked on water, and he started to sink when he was close enough that Jesus could reach out and save him. The only reason Peter was able to be saved is because of how close he was able to get to Jesus. Peter was in that perfect position. Peter did what we all need to do. He got out of the boat, and when he started to sink, he cried for help, and he was so close to the Lord that the Lord could easily save him. As a parent, that's your job. I really believe as a parent, you are to be like Jesus in that scenario. That you are supposed to help your child process through their failure, not to help them avoid failure altogether. Whether dealing with feelings of discomfort or feelings of failure, I think there are a few simple questions a parent can ask their child. And I want to give you this advice. I want to actually lay out for you some practical things that you can say to your children. When your child is struggling and when they're having problems, ask them this question. What part did you play in this? What part did you play in this? That's what you want your child to learn, because that's what they can actually change. I think there's great lessons that can be learned from that. We can use the example of a child struggling at school. I see that oftentimes in my work. A helicopter or lawnmower parent is going to go in and they are going to try to step in and solve that problem for the child. They are going to shield their child from having to be uncomfortable, from having to deal with their teacher. But the right answer is to let your child figure it out for themselves and ask them, what are they doing that has helped created this problem? Oftentimes the answer is simple. It's not rocket science. Maybe they didn't do their homework, or maybe they did their homework and they did a sloppy job. Maybe they didn't read the assignment and they were completely unprepared for what happened. Help them figure out what it is that they did to create the problem. And I've had people, of course, say to me, well, my child did nothing wrong. Well, first of all, I don't think that's normally the case at all. But if for some reason that is the case, I actually think as a parent, you have the greatest opportunity of all. Because at that point, you get the blessing of teaching your child that there are difficult people in this world and that you might have to figure out how to navigate someone who is difficult, someone who is mean, someone who is unfair, someone who you don't agree with. Be thankful as a parent that you have the opportunity to teach this to your child, because it is one of the greatest gifts that you can give them. If you can teach your child how to learn to deal with difficult people without bailing them out of the situation, guess what you've done? You've taught your child a skill that will last them an entire lifetime. Be thankful if you have an opportunity like that. I think there's another question you can ask your child, though, in a tough situation. Ask them what they're going to do differently next time. What are you going to do differently to make sure you get your homework done on time? What are you going to do differently if your teacher calls on you so you won't be embarrassed? What are you going to do differently next time you don't pass the test? What are you going to do differently if you feel like someone has been unfair to you and you have to have an adult conversation with them? What are you going to do differently? That gets your child to see that there are healthy ways to deal with a problem. And most importantly, it teaches them to take responsibility for their actions. A third and final question you could ask, again, is very simple. What did you learn from this? What did you learn from being embarrassed when your teacher called on you and you weren't prepared to have the answer? What did you learn from not passing the test? Put the responsibility back on your child instead of taking the responsibility away from them. Now, again, I know how this goes because I've counseled many people in my life. And I know that there are people who will say, no, look, you don't understand. My child's teacher's different. They're really difficult. Look, I understand it. Again, I'll repeat it. There are effective and ineffective teachers. There are ineffective and effective people in this world. But let me ask you, when is your child going to be able to learn how to deal with difficult people? When is your child going to learn how to deal with an ineffective teacher? Where do you think your child is going to learn to deal with injustice? This is something that we don't say often anymore, but life's not fair. And there are things out there that are difficult. We have to learn how to wade through those things. Part of learning for everyone involves being uncomfortable. Part of loving your child responsibly means you let them feel uncomfortable and you let them fail, especially if it teaches them how to be accountable for their actions in the process. And number 5, failure teaches resiliency. You know, most people who study this stuff for a living will tell you that resiliency is the single most important piece out there. People who show traits of being resilient tend to actually have several important qualities that people who don't have resiliency lack. Number 1 is people who are resilient have gratitude. Resilient people always know their situation can be worse. They don't over-exaggerate how bad things are, and they don't run around predicting that it's going to get worse. They view situations in a proper perspective. In other words, these people aren't overly dramatic. They simply deal with the hand that they've been dealt. You know, when I look around our country right now and us talking about how did we get here, I will tell you that I think that there is a real problem with resiliency in younger generations. Everything, and I mean literally everything, is blown out of proportion. Everything's a big deal. Everybody's offended. Guess what, though? Everything's not a big deal. In life, very few things are really a big deal. And if we have resiliency, we're able to step back and we're able to see that properly. Another thing that people who are resilient have that others don't is they look for lessons they can learn. That's what we were just talking about. They don't make excuses. They learn from their mistakes. Failure is evidence to them that they are stretching themselves. Failure is evidence to them that they are growing. Resilient people also respect their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses. People who are resilient know they have weaknesses, and they pay attention to those. They are authentic and not afraid to admit that they fail. They know that they are good at some things, and they're not haughty and arrogant about the things that they are good at. And they know how to use their skill well. But they also know that they can be better. They know failure is not the end of the journey. It's just the beginning. And when they fail, they simply look at how can I do this better? And another very important piece, maybe the most important piece of all, a resilient person's self-worth is not dependent upon their achievements. Resilient people feel good about themselves even when they fail because they have confidence and they know they can learn from their mistakes. They know they can recover. They know they can do better next time. So if you want to be a good parent, I simply just have one piece of advice for you. That's it. Teach your children how to fail. Teach them that failing means they are trying. Help them understand that failure gives them proper perspective. Failure teaches us what's important and what isn't. And finally, failure makes us tough and it makes us resilient. It helps us to be stronger people, to be stronger spouses, to be stronger parents, and ultimately to be stronger Christians. Failure sharpens us and shapes us into exactly who God intends for us to be. Just ask Peter. He knows exactly what that's about. Thank you for being here, and I hope this has been what you guys were looking for. Thank you.
All right, we're back with Ryan Daniels. So good to have you back with us at Washington Avenue Church of Christ for our Bible series. You just gave your second lesson in our series and talking about some very tough things. And your title is pretty catchy, right? Because it's counterintuitive to what we want. Raising successful children by teaching them how to fail. No one enjoys failing.
Absolutely. That's not something he was like.
Why is failure so important?
You know, failure is one of those things that teaches us how to cope. It teaches us resiliency, how to, I hate to use the old phrase, how to pick yourself up by the bootstraps and keep going.
Sure.
And I think that has a lot to do with kind of where we are as a society, is this idea of not being able to handle things when things don't go exactly how we think they should go.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. What are some examples you've seen of that?
Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is probably a little controversial, but it's kind of how things went in the last presidential election after it was over, the responses that we had. And I'm not trying in any way, in any way be political, but just the response of people not going to school or colleges creating safe spaces so people have opportunities to deal with to deal with how they feel about it. I'm a therapist. I'm all about dealing with how you feel about things.
Sure.
But to me, it's kind of difficult when people want to just stop when things don't go the way that they want them to go. I think that's a sign of unhealthy coping mechanisms. I think that's a sign of not having resiliency and not being able to power through things when we should. Right. And I think there's a big difference in, being disappointed that something doesn't go the way you want it to go, yet kind of going on with life and life completely shutting down. and you not being able to function because something didn't go the way you wanted it to.
Because certainly something that we know in life, especially as Christians, there's going to be disappointments in life.
Absolutely.
It's going to happen. We see that in the church. The person that you converted falls away from the church. As a minister, that's devastating.
Yeah.
Marriages sometimes get real rocky. That's devastating.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to take, when I hear, and I don't think I'm alone, I think there's a lot of people that hear it. When I hear that people completely fall apart because of some of the things you're discussing, it's hard to put that in a framework where I can go, oh, I'm going to feel compassionate for those people.
Yeah.
There's a tendency to be kind of repulsed by that behavior, but I don't think that's a Christian response.
No, I don't either. I agree.
How do we become more compassionate to that situation so that we can help people develop those coping skills?
Well, and I think about it from a counselor perspective. You know, I see people that come in and have issues that, you know, and maybe in my mind, I'm going, are you kidding me? This person is coming to counseling for this issue.
And do you say that to them as your counselor?
Absolutely not. Right? I mean, that's my point right there.
You can't.
That, you know, I want to build a connection with that person. I want to get to know that person. And then, you know, when I have, you know, I had a licensor supervisor that once said to me, you have to earn the right to say something to someone.
Okay.
And I remember that when I'm dealing with counseling.
And what did he mean by that?
What was meant by that was very simply is if someone comes in the room to counsel with you, that was the context of the quote.
Okay.
If someone comes in the room to counsel with you and you are, you know, you were judgmental or you were snarky or you make them feel like you're not taking them seriously, they're not going to listen to you. But if you connect with them, if you let them know you care about them, that they are important and valuable to you, then after a while you can challenge that thought process. You can challenge them on what they're struggling with or what they're standing on. You have to earn that right. And I think too often what we do is we see somebody that disagrees with us or is different than us or views the world, you know, in a way that we don't, and we immediately go into attack mode. And that doesn't work. I mean, I think it's fine to challenge somebody's thought process. I would encourage that. I'm big into debates and things like that. I grew up loving that stuff. But you have to be respectful and understand where the individual's coming from.
Right. A lot of growth can take place from the right kind of tension.
Absolutely.
The right kind of struggle. But there's some things that just aren't acceptable behaviors.
Yeah.
And I think we have to value the person.
Absolutely. That's the key.
Over the idea that they're bringing.
And we were talking about failure. You know, I mentioned in my lesson a minute ago about Peter. You know, I used Peter as an example and all of the struggles and the issues that he goes through. And what was happening? Peter's failures, him sticking his foot in his mouth, him making the mistakes that he made, what did they do? They made Peter into who he became.
Yeah.
And I think that's what parents miss today about this idea of failure is they want to shield their children from any kind of failure or any kind of disappointment. And what that's doing is keeping them from becoming who they want to be or who they need to be. That's the irony of the whole thing. What if Jesus had never been tough on Peter? What if Peter had never had those failures? Would Peter have become who he became? Of course not.
Absolutely not. And how beautiful is it that the Holy Spirit determined we needed to see those.
Absolutely.
Not to put Peter down, but so that we recognize, hey, we're going to go through those same things.
And can I say this, Mo? I hope this, you know, I think about, and I mentioned this at the very beginning of my lesson, and I use the story of Peter walking on the water out to Jesus.
Sure.
And I know I'm repeating what I said in my lesson, but every time I've heard that lesson preached, it's always about Peter sinking because of his lack of faith. That's not the story. The story is there's an entire boat full of apostles, and Peter is the one apostle that gets out of the boat, walks on the water to Jesus.
On it. Yeah.
And when he starts to sink, he's close enough to Jesus that Jesus can save him. No other apostle is there. That failure makes Peter who he becomes. Those failures are necessary. And I think about too, and again, this just came from my lesson a moment ago, but you know, I think about Michael Jordan. I've got a poster in my counseling office of Michael Jordan, and it's not a poster of him dunking or anything like that. It's a poster that simply has a quote, and he says, you know, I have missed 9,000 shots in my career.
Right, yeah.
You know, 300 times I've lost a game.
How long have you had that poster?
I've had that poster for probably 20 years.
I had a feeling.
Yeah.
I had a feeling, yeah.
And, you know, he talks about 26 times I've been asked to take a game-winning shot and I've missed it. And he talks about failure is what creates success.
Right.
And I believe it. We don't think of Michael Jordan as a failure, but those failures, he remembers those. Those have driven him to be what he ultimately became. And I know we could argue, maybe Michael Jordan's got other things going on in his life, but
sure,
but we look at him as this great model of success.
Absolutely.
And he succeeds because he failed.
Absolutely. I think about that in so many other ways, and what I'm interested in when I hear guys like Michael Jordan or various other sports people or business people, inventors, their mental process to overcome the failures or to see those failures as a learning. They're part of the process, and they view them as a very necessary part of the process. And there was a rock climber, and he did this tremendous feat, and you could tell the interviewer wanted to get in to view it as like, but the adrenaline, you're doing it for the adrenaline, and how did you prepare for that one moment? And he's like, it wasn't this one moment. I had done this so much, and I had went through this so many times that it was just, okay, I'm doing this now, sort of thing. And so there was years of prep to get to that moment. Yeah, to get through it.
And I think about that in today's society. I worry when we have schools creating safe spaces for someone to process their feelings because an election didn't go how they wanted to go. Is that person going to have the perseverance of Michael Jordan? Sure. Is that person going to have the perseverance of that rock climber? Is that person going to be able to be resilient and to overcome? I mean, I believe that's how we succeed in life, is we have to experience things not going well. And this gets into a whole nother, I guess, thing, but I think about we prep our kids from the time they're 6 to, some parents do, to play professional baseball or to do those things, and we're kind of, and they don't want them to ever fail. They don't want them to not strike out 15 every game or anything like that.
Sure.
But those failures are the things that causes people to pick themselves up, to recognize the mistakes they made, to say, I'm going to be better. We have to have it. And I think that's why the Bible clearly displays all of these people like Peter. I think about Moses. One of my favorite lessons I ever did years ago, I still remember it, which I don't remember most of the lessons I've ever done, but I remember this lesson I did about Moses' 5 excuses.
Sure.
And all the excuses he made when God was trying to get him to go to Pharaoh. And I love that because that's us. If you or I were if we were in that spot, we'd be making excuses and trying to get out of it. And that failure is what makes him great. Because he rises above that.
I think there's a tendency because that's always a fun game to play when you're reading Bible stories. Who am I in this story? Or what period of their life? And typically people would like, well, I would be the Moses during the 10 plagues and I'm free. No,
you wouldn't.
No. Take the whole story. The whole story of David has got his failures in it. Moses has got his failures in it. And the beauty of having those failures is that we recognize our lives are going to have those moments of failures as well.
Yeah.
And there's a richness. God's equipping us in that to kind of move forward.
And if we avoid failure like it's the plague, like it's the coronavirus, if we avoid failure in that way, what does that do to us?
Right.
I think it creates, if I'm really honest, I think it creates a lot of what we have in our younger generations.
Right.
Because I do think they have been taught, quite honestly, I don't think it's a flaw in the individual. I think it's a learned behavior. They have been taught to avoid failure. I mean, I think about schools that we have schools who don't fail children, who they're going to pass regardless.
Right.
Well, when I grew up, if I failed, I failed. Nobody's going to pass me to the next grade because I was there. And that attitude permeates, that attitude of just not experiencing challenges and failures. That's where we grow.
How is this different than running to the failures? Or is there a difference?
Well, that's a great question.
Some people might want to settle in their failures.
Yeah, and people can do that. There's no doubt about it that people can kind of do that. But I think, it reminds me of, and this may be getting into something else, but it reminds me when I counsel with people, I talk about the difference between guilt and shame from a psychological perspective. Okay. And I talk about that guilt is very healthy because guilt is what causes us to mess up and make mistakes and go, I'm going to be okay. I can recover from this. Whereas I talk about shame from a psychological perspective of I've messed up and I've made mistakes and the mistake now identifies me. My mistake is who I am.
Right.
And I, when I'm talking to clients, I talk about that difference. You want to experience guilt because you want to be able to overcome. Shame keeps you stuck in the failure. The failure is who you are. And I actually think that may be the reason we run from it, is because people think if they mess up or they make a mistake that that's who they are, that they are a failure.
Right.
As opposed to, I failed.
Right.
There's a total difference viewpoint of that.
True. Do you see that happening a lot with Christians, that they identify, I am a failure, which is difficult to process because on one hand, well, I'm not a failure. I'm created in God's image. I'm not a failure. Jesus died for my sins. I'm not in those, but at the same time, they hold themselves back sometimes.
Yeah.
What have you seen that's been able to help people in that regard?
Well, when you kind of have that attitude, one thing, and this kind of pains me to say because I don't ever want to be critical of the church. I love the church, obviously, but we create this environment sometimes where I think we shame people.
How do you mean?
And well, you think about when somebody responds to the gospel or responds, and how do the people in the auditorium respond to the individual? There are going to be some people who.
What did they do?
That's it.
Yeah.
What did they do? And there are people who maybe are really repulsed or disgusted by what that person did, and I don't want to have anything to do with it.
Right.
Well, what is that? That is shame.
Sure.
But if we love that person, we embrace that person, we forgive that person, we're teaching guilt. And so we shame people sometimes by our response to their failures and their sins.
Right.
And I think we have to be really careful of that. I mean, I always use the example, and maybe it's a bad one, but I use the example of what happens if one of your teens gets pregnant at this church. How do people respond? There are going to be people who lovingly embrace them and say, let them know I'm disappointed.
Sure.
I'm disappointed in what you've done, but I love you. I care about you. We're going to help you fight through this battle.
Sure.
That teaches guilt. But there also are probably going to be people, if we're honest, that are going to turn their back on that person. They may lose friends. They may have people that view them totally differently now because of the mistake that they made. And that's shame. That's that unhealthy shame where you were teaching that person, I love you if you do what's right. I don't love you if you don't. It's conditional. Yeah. Love becomes conditional in that spot. And I think this all ties back to that idea of failure. People are so scared to mess up sometimes because the environment doesn't allow it.
Right. So it's important that we cultivate an environment that's going to say, if you do mess up, we're going to help you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't want you to mess up. We're going to teach you how to, not dive into sinful behaviors. But when it happens, if it does happen, this is a place where people are going to put your arms around you.
And I always tell, I've told some clients this before, some teenage clients. I said, look, I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem if you mess up and make a mistake. I kind of hope you do sometimes. But what I do worry about is don't make those mistakes that are life-changing. Sure. There are those mistakes. We can go to that point where they are life-changing mistakes that destroy lives. I mean, that's really in the context of things, not what we're talking about here.
Right.
We're talking about failures that create you to become a better person.
Right, absolutely. So kind of building on that just a little bit, you discussed some things in your lesson. You talked about a helicopter and a lawnmower parent.
Yeah.
Now, those may not be terms that people are super familiar with. Mm-hmm. Can you explain those for me a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. A helicopter parent is that parent who hovers over their child.
Okay.
And they always are right above them, and they kind of don't let them go out into the world and make their mistakes and mess up. They're always hovering over them. So that's why it's called a helicopter.
It may not be the best practice to be a helicopter parent.
Absolutely. I mean, and then the other one, the lawnmower parent, that's the parent that literally mows down every obstacle in their child's way. That's why it's called a lawnmower. They mow every obstacle down. So these are your parents who are going to, and this happens. My wife works at a university. This has happened. She said, I have literally had parents call me. And you go, wait, what? You have parents call you? Their child might be 21, and their parent is calling to deal with an issue.
Wow.
And you go, how is that healthy? How is that healthy that an adult, we're talking about an adult, and their parents stepping in to call? My wife works in IT, so she's usually dealing with their accounts and those kinds of things. And people are parents have called her before, or a parent's looking for a professor to talk to a professor about an issue. And you go, are you kidding? Like, how is that healthy?
Sure.
And that's the kind of things that a helicopter or a lawnmower parent are going to do. A lawnmower parent, I think, is even more dangerous than the helicopter. I always think about the helicopter of trying to keep their child in a bubble. They're trying to keep their child from, doing anything, or from messing up, making mistakes, harming themselves. A lawnmower parent is going to be the more attacking. They're going to be the person that if their child fails a test in school, it's the parent's fault.
Okay.
Or, I'm sorry, the teacher's fault.
The teacher's fault,
yeah,
right.
The teacher's fault. The parent says, it's the teacher's fault. My kid didn't fail this test. You obviously, there's a reason that it's your fault.
So right now we may have people that are listening that they're going to hear this and they're saying, oh no, I'm a lawnmower parent, or oh no, I'm a helicopter parent. And of course you're not attacking them at the moment, but what are some things that they could do to pull out of that? Because that's not going to be a snap your fingers and...
Oh, no. I mean, I think about first, what do we say, counseling? First, you got to understand there's a problem before you can solve that problem.
Sure.
You got to realize that's what you're doing, that you are hovering over your child, or you are mowing down things that are in your child's way. And once you learn that, you've got to make a concerted effort. I mean, there is plenty of literature about how to be a successful parent that I think has some really great things. One of the things that I teach, and we're not really talking about that here a lot, but I'll do a class on parenting styles, and I will talk about if you parent like this is how your child will probably turn out. If you parent like this
Most
is
likely, sure.
Yeah. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, and I always talk about the authoritative parent is the best parent, and I'll talk a little bit about that in one of my lessons.
Okay.
And the authoritative parent is that parent that they have rules and expectations and guidance, but they also give their children room to grow. They give their children room to fail. They let their children become responsible. And so it's that perfect balance of a foot in both worlds, where I'm allowing my child to be their own person.
Sure.
But I'm giving them guidance, I'm giving them rules, I'm giving them directions.
Some expectations.
Yeah. And it's that balance. That's the tightrope we walk as parents, is I need a foot in both worlds. If I am too authoritative, and become a drill sergeant,
sure,
I'm going to create some issues for my child. If I'm too permissive and I allow my child to just do their own thing, I'm going to create problems with my child. So I've got to figure out where that balance is and put a foot in both worlds. And that's hard. I mean, I'm a parent of 2 kids myself. That's hard, but that's the goal, is to be a parent, but allow that child room to mess up, to fail, to make mistakes, and to learn from them.
And that's a thing that parents don't have to do in isolation. They can discuss that with each other.
Absolutely.
And obviously one of the great lessons out of the Bible, I'm thinking particularly in Titus, the older people can teach the younger people
Absolutely.
exactly how to do that. So very, very experienced parents, that's a wealth of wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think churches need to pull on those resources they have and other places for that as well. How do you think we as a society feed into this? Maybe we don't even know. But how do we feed into that?
I guess there are so many answers that my mind just goes everywhere when you say that.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing that I really think of is social media.
Okay,
and I am not a social media hater. Okay. I think there are positive things about it, but the problem that I think it really, really creates is this fake life that we all live.
Sure.
I heard somebody say, I'm a huge music fan, and I heard somebody say, Facebook is the greatest hits record, and it doesn't have all the terrible album cuts on it. And I think that's a really good analogy. We take, there are teenage girls who are guilty that may be watching this, that take 20 selfies, but try to make it look like they took that selfie when they rolled out of bed.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
there's tutorials on how to do that.
And there are people who 10 seconds before they took that family picture that looks perfect and beautiful, they were bickering and arguing and fussing and fighting and all that, and then they put the perfect portrait of the family on, and everybody goes, I wish my family was like that. Right. And so I think there is this expectation of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram creates this expectation that we all are perfect. that we're not flawed, that we don't make mistakes, because everybody sees that.
Right.
And we know it. I mean, we know in our minds, I mean, you and I both know, we all do, that's not reality. But yet studies clearly show the more time you spend on Facebook, the more likely you are to be depressed. I mean, that is a correlational fact.
Does that happen with Instagram and TikTok?
Oh yeah,
and
all of those apps. The more time you spend on those, the more likely you are to have depression and anxiety.
Now I'm going to ask you a little bit harder question here, very specific. Is there a particular age you would recommend parents to allow their child to start getting into that? That's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, the answer is not the answer anybody likes. I don't think there is a particular age. I will tell you, I have a 12-year-old son, and to this point, I have not allowed that. And it's not because I'm being difficult or anything like that. I just think there are so many challenges. I just don't think it's good. And
Sure.
And why does he need to be on Facebook?
Right.
I mean, why? I mean, he plays video games with his friends online. Is that, I mean, he sees his friends at school every day, at least when coronavirus is not around, he does.
Sure,
and
sure.
I mean, and right now my kids are going to school. So, I mean, so why does he need to go on Facebook? And so that's a decision we've made as parents. I wouldn't tell a parent if you're allowing your child on at that age that they're wrong.
Right.
I would say if you are allowing your kids on at that age, you need to have full and complete access.
Absolutely.
To their account, and you need to not only have the access, you need to check it all the time.
Sure.
To see what's going on, to see what's being said, to see what messages are sent. If the child is a child, meaning they are under 18 and they are in my household, I have every right to view their phone. And I know a lot of parents don't view that way, but I'm sorry. I think it's necessary for us to parent at that point to really pay attention to what our children are doing.
I agree with you 100%. It's hard to say that there is a hard and fast number. Life just doesn't work that way. We don't even do that with when a person could become a Christian. So it's really hard to deal with that. But is there any particular maturity markers that you could say maybe they could dabble a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I do think you have to know your child. I mean, all of these issues are know your child basis. My 12-year-old is very mature. I mean, he acts like we joke that he acts like an old man, and I think I don't think it's that he couldn't handle it. And I think you just have to know your child. I mean, and I know that's probably not an answer everybody wants to hear, but I think it's true. You have to know your child, and your child has to gain trust. I think about give your child smaller things to see if they're responsible. Do they give them chores? Give them, how do they do their homework assignments on their own when they get home in the afternoon and you don't even have to ask them? Are they cleaning their room by themselves without you having? I mean, what kind of things are they doing to show you they have a level of maturity?
And communicate those expectations.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Those need to be. But what kind of things are they doing to show you that they are mature individuals? You're going to see maturity in life, just the day-to-day things that they are doing.
Right.
And if they have that, you can give them a little more leeway.
Right.
But it's a classic know your child. I mean, and that's the thing. We want the number, or we want the specific. And I will tell you, as a therapist, those don't exist. I mean, it's a case-by-case basis.
It would make life easier, but it just doesn't happen that way. So
that's exactly right.
Now I'm going to switch just a little bit here. We've talked about this a lot, and the focus of this was raising children to fail, sort of thing. But sometimes adults need to recognize that as well. Any comments or suggestions you would give for adults who are wrestling with that? Because I know a slew of adults, they are terrified to fail. It grips them in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
What do you say to the adults?
I guess it depends on how bad the failure actually is.
Sure.
I always think about, from a counseling perspective, you always look at, I think about like with anxiety, they say, there may be people who have a level of anxiety, but it doesn't affect their day-to-day life.
Sure.
And if it affects their day-to-day life, it's a problem.
That's when it's a problem.
I would say failure's like that. I don't like to fail. You don't like to fail. Does that mean we have a problem with that? I mean, I hope I don't. But if you are in a situation where failure grips you, meaning I might not take this chance to do this thing or chase this opportunity because I'm afraid I would fail, to me that is an issue and a problem. And I would just say, look at those Bible stories. Look at the Bible stories and ask yourself that question: why did God place those there? He placed those there to show us that even these people that we hold in incredible esteem, that we teach our classes around, they're failures.
Yeah.
All of them. And we've got to learn that if we're going to be what God wants us to be, we have to experience failure. If not, we're holding ourselves back.
All the time. It doesn't matter if we're trying evangelism for the first time, sit down and have a Bible study with someone, you're going to make mistakes.
Absolutely.
You're trying to learn to be a teacher in the church, you're going to make mistakes. Any of those things that you could do in the church as an adult, those are going to come with some moments of failure. So.
I think about I've said some things about my licensure supervisor back years ago when I was getting my license, and I was counseling a married couple. And when I first started, I love marriage counseling now, but at first I did not want to do marriage counseling. Really? I kind of hated it. And because it was hard to navigate two people in the room and they're bickering and fighting. And, now I've learned to do that. But I came to her and I said, I had this married couple, and I said, I just don't think I did a good job. I really don't. I really felt like I didn't know what I was doing. And she goes, do you have a master's degree in psychology? Oh, yes, ma'am. She goes, are you licensed? And I go, well, yeah, I will be as soon as we finish this. And she goes, stop. She goes, you know more than they do about counseling. And you know more about marriage therapy than they do. And she said, you didn't hurt a thing by them being in the room. She said, now you might could have done a better job. But she said, you did fine. And stop beating yourself up about it, because you are capable and you have the education and you know what you're doing. And it was just like that, that kind of punch to the gut that goes, okay, she's right.
That's one of those pivotal moments when you're
you think about it. I don't remember what I ate for lunch yesterday, but I remember her saying that, and it was a very pivotal moment to recognize, yes, I can do this. And although I didn't do a good job then, if I hadn't had, now I've been doing it for over a decade. So at this point, I kind of do feel like I know what I was doing. But if I didn't have those sessions where I felt like I was hanging on by a thread, I would have never gotten to that point. And I think we all experience that. Same thing with you. I mean, we all experience that. We get better.
If you're not, there's probably there's an issue.
That's right.
There's an issue.
That's right.
Well, Ryan, thanks so much for being here with us again today.
You bet.
Really appreciate you being here. Look forward to your next lesson, and look forward to talking to you again.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.